be here now. Just be here now.
Welcome to the Road Home Podcast with Ethan Nichtern. Join Ethan as he and his guests explore the Buddhist path as it relates to art, culture, activism, politics, Western psychology, and more. If you'd like to support Ethan's podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Ethan.
All right. So, hi, everybody. This is Ethan Nichtern. Welcome back to the Road Home Podcast. And I'm here with my friend and Zen teacher, filmmaker, and award-winning novelist, which I think that's a rare combination of things, especially the award-winning novelist and Zen teacher, Ruth Ozeki, who I've interviewed before on the Interdependence Project podcast, but first time on the Road Home Podcast. So, Ruth, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks. Thanks so much, Ethan. It's great to be here.
So you have a new novel out, but I always ask people a slightly cheesy lead-in question, which is to ask them their origin story with meditation, if they're a meditation person, which you are. And I kind of want to ask you both your origin story with meditation, and then want to ask you your origin story becoming a writer and knowing you were a writer. So
yeah, absolutely.
How did you get into meditation first?
All right. Well, I mean, okay. So this is, it's an origin story, but it goes way back. I'm 65 now, so we're talking about when I was 3. Okay. And this is the first memory I have as a person. Okay. And the memory is that my Japanese grandparents were coming from Japan to see us, to visit us. And I'd never met them before. So this was a big deal. This was like really exciting. And they must have arrived at night. Because the next morning I woke up and my mother must have, and this is not part of the memory, I'm getting to the memory, but my mother must have asked me to go and wake them up and tell them, call them for breakfast. So what I remember is standing in front of my parents' bedroom door, and it was closed. And I remember reaching up, because the doorknob was way above my head, reaching up and opening the door and pushing it open and looking in the room and seeing these 2 old Japanese people sitting on the floor, right? Cross-legged on the floor. And they were rocking, side to side like this with their eyes closed. And this was like the weirdest thing I had ever seen in my entire 3 years of life, right? And just then because adults didn't sit on the floor, not in New Haven, Connecticut, right? And so just at that moment, I was looking at this. Just at that moment, my grandfather opened his eyes and he looked right at me. And we were the same height because he was sitting on the floor, right? So it was like this moment of literally face-to-face transmission. He's just finishing Zazen and he opens his eyes and he looks at me. And I just remember that that sort of moment where our eyes met. And then I think at that point, I just turned around and ran from the room because it was the weirdest thing I'd ever, encountered. But I just never have forgotten that. It's the earliest memory I have. And I think, in a way, I was like a little duckling, that kind of imprinted on this, this image. And I remember just as I was growing up, I was always fascinated by meditation. And I think when I was 7, I had a little book called Zen. And that was a book of koans and stories, Zen stories. And I remember reading that and then trying to meditate by myself. I remember I had a birthday candle and, lit the candle and was staring at the flame, thinking that this was meditation. And then when I was around 13, I was initiated into transcendental meditation. and received my, my mantra, which was like, whoa, it's super cool.
At 13, wow.
At 13, yeah. They had a special deal. Like there was a special deal where you could, if you were like, young, you could get your mantra for like, I don't know, it was like cheap, it was like $20 or something like that.
Cheap mantra.
Yeah.
That's a good band name.
It was, yeah, right. I know. I love that. Cheap mantra. It's great. And so a bunch of us went into Boston and I got my mantra and I thought that was like really cool. And then, so anyway, the story just kind of continues like that. I just kept trying to understand what meditation was and practicing in different traditions. At one point, I was studying with Judy. I was going to the Shambhala Center in New York, and Judy Leaf was my meditation instructor there. And that's really when I got serious about it. And I think by then I was in my late 30s, and my parents were old and they were sick. And it was clear to me that, that they were going to die. Isn't that the story? Sickness, old age, and death, right? And that's when I got really serious about it. And I realized that this was, that the meditation practice was the thing that could help. It was the one thing that I could kind of rely on to help me. I was also trying to quit smoking. So addiction is, it's really helpful when you're trying to get serious about meditation. It gave me something, the meditation gave me something to come back to. And that's, that's kind of how I got started. And then later, because kind of came full circle because I met Norman Fisher and came back, returned to the Zen tradition that I think, was close to what my grandparents were practicing at the very beginning. Although this time, Norman is, this nice Jewish guy from, Pennsylvania. But it was it was still a return to the, to the forms and to the tradition that, that my ancestors had practiced.
So do you want to go through a writing origin story? Or
Yeah. Probably started around the same time. Maybe not 3. I don't think, maybe it did. Maybe it started when I was 3. But certainly by the time I was 7, I was writing. And that was, this was a long time ago. This was like in the early 60s. Right. And I remember, I was an avid reader and I loved, stories. I loved fiction. And I remember, just trying to write them, trying to write stories when I was little. And always wanting to, really being drawn to narrative, to storytelling. But at the same time, always having a feeling that somehow I wasn't really entitled to that. I'd never read any fiction by somebody who, looked like me, who came from, my particular kind of mixed up racial heritage. It was, it was years before, it was 20 years before, Maxine Hong Kingston wrote Warrior Woman. And it was also, Amy Tan didn't write Joy Luck Club, I think, until I was in my 30s, right? So, it was not something that, there was nobody I could look up to as, writers who had done this thing that I was trying to do, or that I wanted to do. And so as a result, I kind of, I was kind of looking for a writing form that I felt I was entitled to. And so poetry seemed more accessible at that time. And I remember trying to write haiku, when I was little, and it just was it was a disaster. I mean, I'm a novelist, right? I use too many words, right? And so haiku was just not a natural fit. But then, little by little, I kept trying. In college, I wrote short fiction. I won some prizes. And then always wanted to write, but I always wanted to write long form fiction. I wanted to write novels. And the problem was that I didn't know how. And back then, I don't know, I'd never heard of, MFA programs. It never occurred to me to go to, to go to an MFA program. And I remember that I was, in particular, that I was just really not understanding how to move a story through time, right? How to move a story kind of quickly and efficiently and, in an exciting way, just sort of moving a story through time. Didn't know how to do that. And it wasn't until, I started working in film, and that was just a kind of an accident that I ended up getting into the film business. But it wasn't until I really started working in film and television and learned how to edit. Right. I spent hundreds of hours in the editing room, editing images, right, into television shows. And, TV is not, you really have to move a story quickly through time if you're dealing with television, right? People have, a story just has to really jump out and grab you within the first couple of minutes, and then it has to move quickly ever after. And so that was really where I learned how to do that. And so when I then, after spending years in film and television, came back to writing fiction, I suddenly realized that I knew how to do it. It was like, oh, wow, this thing that I thought was so difficult, moving a character from one end of the room to the other end of the room where the action was occurring, that thing that was so difficult to do, a few years earlier, suddenly I knew how to do it. And that was a breakthrough.
Do you have any, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about why, like you said, haiku and poetry, and I think like both East and West, these contemplative traditions, especially Buddhism, like the literary art form that is aligned with practicing Dharma is poetry. And I can think of one reason, like if you're, at least with fiction narrative, you're making something up at least to a certain degree. Is that why we don't think of like writing fiction as Buddhist, or is it because it's too long, or what do you think?
It's too many words and letters, I think poetry is seen as a more spontaneous expression that occurs in the moment, right? Yeah. And it's there and then it vanishes, right? And so there's a kind of an ephemeral quality to it. This is I think the way that some people think about poetry. I don't believe poetry is like that. I know that, most poets I know, struggle mightily, over long periods of time, editing and, whatever, tweaking, and, it's a lot of hard work. But I think that the sort of the popular notion of the poem being a kind of a spontaneous, and especially, Zen, I'm thinking Zen poetry, right? Death poems, for example, the Zen poetry, it's this kind of spontaneous, arising of a feeling that is expressed in a few spare words and then vanishes, right? I think that notion somehow seems more in keeping with, what we think of as a kind of Zen-like practice. So I think that's part of it, and I think too that the complex kind of cumbersome apparatus of a novel, for example, which, it really is an exercise in samsara, isn't it? You're building this like huge, elaborate story, right? Yeah. So again, looking at it kind of superficially, it seems like nothing could be less Buddhist than, engaging in this, completely wholehearted, immersive way in the elaborate construction of a samsaric world, right? Which is funny, but that's what we do anyway, right? That's whether we write it down and call it a novel or whether we live it every day, it's the same thing, right? Right. So in that sense, I don't really see that much difference.
Yeah, it's also interesting because I was thinking, because I actually like to write all three of those, which is weird because like my self-assessment, which would probably be different from other people's assessment of me, but I would like writing fiction the best. I'm probably actually the best at writing poetry, and I'm always going to be best known for writing nonfiction. So I've just kind of like tried to oriented that. But the thing about like there is a new genre. Like there was a novel called How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, and I would say that your last novel, A Tale for the Time Being, you did something that's somewhat similar to what my friend from college, Ben Lerner, does in his novels, which I would like. The term I would use is like a reality adjacent novel.
Yes.
Like there's a woman named Ruth who's the main character, the second main character in A Tale for the Time Being. She's you, but she's not you. So yeah, is that how? So yeah, I wonder how Buddhist it is to like sort of tell a true story, but not. Or is that what all fiction is?
I think to me, that's what all fiction is. And I really like that term, reality adjacent. In A Tale for the Time Being, I was just thinking of it too as being, sort of aligned with, the Hugh Everett's, quantum interpretation of quantum theory, which is, the multiverse, right? And these adjacent possible worlds, right? And so, the adjacent Ruth in A Tale for the Time Being happened to be called Ruth in that case, right? And shared a lot with me, but we are not the same person, and well, for one thing, she's made up and, well, I was going to say I'm not, but I guess I'm equally made up, But in any case, we're both made up. She exists on the page, but actually by now she doesn't exist on the page, just on the page. She exists in versions in many people's minds. So it gets very confusing, But I also think that all characters, whether they're called Ruth or not, that all of the characters I write are going to be facets of self, of the story that we call, the self. And so, in a way, writing a novel is kind of like an elaborate psychodrama where you bring facets of the self together, and you have them interact and you watch them, right? So there's certainly a kind of, metacognitive practice there too, watching the facets of self interact in a way that, I'm not going to say it's similar or the same as what we do when we watch our thoughts in meditation, but I mean, maybe it's not that dissimilar either. It's a certain kind of reflection, right? Self-reflection. And I always think about, the Genjo Koan, Dogen's Genjo Koan, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things of the world. And that's seems like a great description of meditation and Buddhist practice, but it also seems like a great description of writing,
Yeah. So why we're here is because your new novel is out, which you said in our text exchanges leading up to this conversation that you're a slow writer, but because you'd been writing this for 9 years, but this is a real opus. And I said, I write a book about every 3 or 4 years, but it's a third the length of this one. So, The Book of Form and Emptiness, which probably wins most Buddhist novel title ever. The Book of Form and Emptiness. So I do want to admit that I haven't finished it yet. I'm 360 pages in, which means I've read more pages of it than most people I have on my podcast when they've read a book. And I think it'd be a good exercise to not tell me how it ends, and also not tell the reader how it ends, not tell the listener how it ends, because we want them to read it. But some things I've noticed. So this is again a book about an adolescent person, in this case Benji, who's in a state of distress, which that part's very similar to Tale for the Time Being. So what is it about adolescence that really that calls to you as a time, especially in the state of, I mean, I could say all adolescents are in a state of distress, but what is it about that time and that sort of representing a difficult time period for a 14, 15-year-old person that has moved you so much?
Yeah. Well, I had a very upsetting adolescence, and so there's a part of me, I think, that continually wants to go back to that period and explore that, and to try to understand, what was happening to me all those many years ago. In A Tale for the Time Being, now was, the main character now, Yasutani, was 14, I guess. She was 14 when the book starts, I think. And is that right? I think she was 14 when the book starts. And she's she's being bullied, terribly bullied by her classmates, is in a cultural situation where she just doesn't fit in. And she is, she's decided that she's going to kill herself. But before she does kill herself, she wants to do one last thing, which is to tell the fascinating life story of her, her great grandmother, who's a 103-year-old Zen Buddhist nun. Okay. And so she sets off to do this thing, which of course she never quite gets around to doing, but in the process, discovers herself as a writer. She's trying to write all of this down in a diary. And she discovers the sort of the redemptive power of writing, right? Of sort of exploring her life through language. And also the power of connection, because the diary goes out into the world. She has this grand idea. She's very dramatic. And I think I was very dramatic at that age too. And, she has this idea to, sort of cast the diary out into the world and somebody would pick it up. She just knew that somebody, a reader would pick it up and would read it. And so the whole diary is addressed to this unknown reader. And this is very much like what writing a novel is. I mean, this, writing a book is, right? You're talking to yourself primarily while you're writing, but you're also talking past the self. You're talking, sort of out into an unknown future, right? Making connections with an unknown reader in the future. But of course, you don't know who that person is or who those people are, right? And so there's this kind of, it's both, it's a kind of conversation that is both directed inward and outward at the same time. And then of course, I think what saves her is this sense of making connections, right? Making a relationship through language in this case, but making a relationship, and the sort of the power and the magic. Because I mean, that book does have a kind of a magical realist element to it as well. But the power and magic that can come from, creating this relationship with another, right? And I think the same thing, I'm exploring the same territory in the Book of Form and Emptiness. The two books are related, actually. They're the whole in the Book of Form and Emptiness. It's set mostly or largely in a library, in a public library, and there's the character of a homeless Slovenian poet philosopher called the Bottle Man. And then there's another character who is an anarchist, young anarchist performance artist, right? With a transgender ferret. And, so these characters, right, existed. They were part of an earlier version of A Tale for the Time Being.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they're refugees from that book, and I really loved these characters, and I loved the location, this kind of large, anonymous, but also sort of slightly magical library, and I very much wanted to bring those back and give them a fictional world that they could live in, and so the two books are, in a way, they're not siblings, but maybe they're cousins, and so Benny, the 14-year-old boy in the Book of Form and Emptiness, is suffering from a terrible loss in his life. His father is killed in a really stupid truck accident. He's hit by a truck and is killed. And Benny and his mother are left behind, and they're suffering from, the loss and, extreme grief that followed the death. And that's when Benny develops, this ability to hear voices. And he at first he hears the voice his dad calling to him, his dead father. But then gradually he starts to hear other voices too. He starts to hear the voices of just the things in his house, right? And so he's a deeply sensitive and receptive boy, and he starts to hear these voices. And of course, in this culture, hearing voices is looked at as a symptom of a pathology, and so he gets into all sorts of trouble that way, and finds his way, finds refuge at this library. And at the library, once again, what he discovers is a connection with the connection with these people, but also a connection with a very special book. And it's his book, right? And the book is a talking object, and it starts to speak with him, right? And so the whole story of the Book of Form and Emptiness is a conversation between Benny and his book, right? And so once again, this idea of redemption coming from, and guidance, and coming from the relationship that we create, that we have with others through language.
And so that's a huge, huge theme, and the theme of the voices that so-called inanimate objects have, which he begins hearing. And then the book itself, there are chapters narrated by the book itself about what books experience, what books want, which are really highly adept philosophical chapters, I found, and almost, maybe you were playing with this edge, like almost preachy, because there's a few times you say nobody wants to hear book preaching, but I thought that was, and I was like, I think this is Ruth in this book. Like Ruth is the book in this book. Like the philosopher Ruth is
actually, yeah. Ruth in this book is the typing lady. The typing. There's a lady who sits at a carrel in the library, and just her fingers are moving all the time, and she's just typing. Right? That's actually Ruth. The book is far beyond me in that sense. The book has got, the book has got opinions,
right.
The book has got many opinions.
But that notion of, I sent you, reminded me of my friend Ian has this really great podcast called Everything is Alive, which is a series of interviews with actors playing each episode as an inanimate object, right? So
loved it. I loved that. It's a wonderful podcast.
It's really funny.
I wish I'd known about it before. Yeah.
He's my old college friend Emily's husband, and she actually, when the podcast was going up, she sent me several reviews that were like, "This is so Buddhist," right? So yeah, how does the Dharma So it's interesting because the notion of a book actually having a life and a consciousness and a set of desires, and that's also brings the library space to life. So my first thought is, do you, if you're not the book, because obviously somebody wrote the book's chapters, are you saying that you also, do we all hear voices when we meditate? Is that?
Well, here's my feeling is that books are inanimate objects, right? They're inanimate objects. I mean, nobody can dispute that. They're made objects, presumably, right? I kind of think of books as being semi-living, and they're objects that speak, right? They're clearly objects that speak to us. And so, I think when we, I don't know whether you want to call it a joke, but the underlying, idea here is that when we read a book, right, we are hearing an object speak. In other words, we are all voice hearers at that point, right? And so when we listen to when we either, listen in the audiobook or read a book, on the page, the very act of doing that turns us all into voice hearers, right? And we might not be able to hear other kinds of objects the way that Benny could hear them. We might not be able to hear a sneaker when it speaks to us, or, a piece of wilted lettuce when it groans, right? But, it doesn't seem that far-fetched to me, I think that I always experience objects as having a kind of feeling tone to them, right? And some objects seem happier than others, right? Some objects seem, like they're suffering. Some objects seem, light. Some objects seem dark. I mean, I have a strong sense of what objects, maybe this is just my sort of overblown imagination, but I do have this feeling. And I also think, honestly, it probably is in part because, being raised, biculturally, in Japan, there's this is not, unusual, right? In Japan, people, the culture treats objects in a very, very different way. Objects, and then you look at something like, to relate this back to the Dharma, there's the famous Zen question, do insentient beings speak the Dharma? And I was very much thinking about that, as I was writing this. Dogen writes a lot about this. It's a wonderful question to turn over in your mind, and to meditate on, right? And so, in Japan, for example, the way that the way that objects are treated, as I said, is very different. So, for example, when you, and there's a spiritual component to this, right? Both in Shinto, the animist traditions of Shinto, but also in Buddhism as well. And so, for example, when you have, say, a needle or pins that you've been using that for a long time, and they break, right? In the West, you just throw them out, obviously, right? I mean, why would you keep them, right? But in Japan, you save them. And then once a year, you bring them to the temple or to the shrine. And there's a ceremony, that is sort of like a funeral, a memorial ceremony. So you take the pin or the broken pin or needle to the temple, and there's a, sort of ceremonial block of tofu, right, on the altar. And you put the pin or the needle in the tofu to give it a soft resting place, right? And then there's a whole, sort of memorial ritual that's carried out in order to thank the object for, for serving you, and for helping you, in your life. And this is really what, Marie Kondo is talking about in her, the rituals that she proposes, so that when you're, for example, throwing out a pair of socks with holes in them, you would hold them, right, first. And you would thank them for the service that they've provided, and then you would throw them away, right? Or you would hold an object, you'd hold an object and feel, in your body, does it spark joy, right? And you can tell, right? I mean, obviously you can tell, because look at the, people, have really caught on to this, right? And it's become so hugely popular. So I think, there's some innate wisdom in treating objects with respect like that. And I think it's very beautiful.
Yeah, I'm thinking of two things. One, how prominent this notion of sacred world or the enriching presence of the world is in the Shambhala teachings. I'm also thinking of Thich Nhat Hanh's commentary on the Heart Sutra, where the notion of form and emptiness are really, it's not the only Mahayana sutra where they're really elaborated, but it's one of the main ones. And where he says, if you are a poet, you can see a cloud floating in the sheet of paper. And to give it a kind of intentionality, a consciousness is a next level. And so you do bring a kind of reality adjacent version of Marie Kondo into the novel as well. And Benny's mother, who's grieving the loss of his father, who was a very beloved Japanese immigrant to, I got the sense that this was happening in Seattle because of the way you described the library. But some American city, unknown American city. And he's a beloved jazz musician. He dies in this horrible accident. And then so Benny's mother, kind of partially because of the work that she does and partially just her process of grieving, becomes a hoarder, but picks up this adjacent version of Marie Kondo's work to what was it called? Tidy Magic.
Tidy Magic. Yeah. A book.
Yeah.
The
a
book. Yeah. That's right.
To kind of try to help her.
That's right.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's interesting. Does that represent sort of, it's interesting because there's part of this that's like when stuff isn't sacred, we just accumulate lots of stuff, which feels very much like the Amazon age, you know, and I know this experience having a 4-year-old child where I'm just like, let's get rid of as much stuff as we possibly can whenever we can. Yeah. She just had a birthday party and we forgot to say, it was an park party, but we forgot to say no presents, please. So, you know, got 40 new presents just from her like friend group. And I just go through the apartment sometimes just being like, can we like, will she notice if we get rid of this? Will she know, you know, this is from last year. And so the non-sacredness of stuff is so prominent in our world. And to give voice to it makes you actually think, I mean, is that the premise that you actually form a relationship with each object?
Well, yes. And I'm as guilty as anyone, accumulating things and
not as Jeff Bezos, but yes, we are equally guilty. We're sort of guilty.
He's guilty.
He's way guiltier.
He's way guiltier. Right.
I'm sorry.
He's probably a minimalist, he's probably like Jobs, he probably has like three T-shirts, that's the thing, if you're tremendously wealthy, you can afford to be a minimalist. But in any case, I had parents who grew up during the Depression, and they weren't hoarders, but they kept everything. And, so, that joke about, finding a box of string that says, little pieces of string too small to be of use, that kind of thing. My mother, literally, I when I was cleaning out her stuff, and I think this actually appears in the book. I think I put it in the book, but I found a little box, right, that said, written in her handwriting very carefully, empty box. And then in Japanese, karabako. Right, which means empty box. So she wrote it like both in English and in Japanese. And sure enough, it was an empty box, right? But this is a sort of philosophical conundrum at this point, because, what do you do with this empty box, right? If you put something in it, it no longer is what it is, right? And so, do you save it? Anyway, so this is the kind of thing that dealing with my parents' stuff, was really, really, really hard. It's one of the hardest things I think I've ever had to do. And it really got me thinking about objects and about what they mean to us and about, what you hang on to, what you let go of. Buddhism is so much about, or certainly, a practice of Buddhism is about, renunciation and about sort of cutting your attachments with the world. And yet as a writer, I am very attached to, these objects and, because this is a material that, that my stories, sort of come from. So, it's been something that I think about a lot and, really I guess that's really why I write, that's why I undertake, a project like a novel, because there's some sort of question that is, nagging me. And I want to try to figure out different ways of, thinking about it, different ways of perceiving it. So I create this fictional world that I can kind of hold in my hand and turn and inspect, and play with and, try to find some sort of, alternate ways of thinking about whatever problem it is that's been bothering me. Yeah.
Thinking more about the notion of treating, because we're also, you recently had an experience in your home, the town of Northampton, Massachusetts, where my mom also lives, where you're a professor at Smith College, and where there's just this awful bureaucratic experience involving a group of cherry trees. So that's another interesting, because trees actually are alive. Yeah. There's a question of whether or not they're sentient, but it's a very interesting story, because you ended up trying to or ordaining these trees in a Zen ceremony in an attempt to save them from the town bureaucracy cutting them down to repave. And it's a very Joni Mitchell, put up a parking lot kind of story.
Yeah. That's right.
But yeah, I mean, but that is an interesting step to have non-human beings been ordained before?
Well, this is it's a very interesting history. This comes from the ordination of trees is something that really started in the 1980s in Thailand, and Buddhist priests in Thailand, Buddhist monastics in Thailand, in order to protect large huge rainforests and vast tracts of forested land from logging, started this movement to ordain trees. And Thailand being a Buddhist country, this was quite effective, because nobody wanted to, once a tree is ordained as as a monastic or as a priest, it carries, there's a karmic burden that is incurred, a cost that's incurred when you start chopping these trees down, mm-hmm. right? And so in Thailand, it was a very effective, strategy, and it's spread to neighboring, Buddhist countries as well. As far as I know, in this country, in North America, there have only been 2 other instances, I think, of tree ordinations. One was in California, a grove of trees that was ordained by a Zen Buddhist priest, also in my tradition, Soto Zen, in order to try to protect them from, being cut down. Unfortunately, they were cut down. And then I think there was another tree in Austin, Texas, and I think also, again, in Soto Zen lineage, that was ordained because it was a big, beautiful, beloved tree. And there wasn't really a protection element there, but it was just a way of honoring the tree. What we did here, there were 7, venerable cherry trees on our block, and it's just a tiny little, street in Northampton that nobody ever travels, nobody ever walks down, right? But the city had money left over in their paving budget, and they needed to spend it. And so they chose our street because it was cheap, right? It was cheap, and there were a few potholes on one end of the street. And then one thing, because of city ordinances and stuff, they once they chose our street to repave, the construction itself was, it was clear that the construction was going to kill the trees. And so then, there was this, push to claim that the trees were diseased, that they needed to come down anyway, that they were old, that they were interfering with the, pavement of the, the sidewalks, and there was some truth to all of this. I mean, the trees were not young trees, they were 30-year-old trees, but they still had, they were vigorously growing trees that, could have lasted for many, many years. So in any case, we went and got involved with this, trying to talk with the city, and to, negotiate some way of saving the trees, but they just simply were not interested in a participatory process here at all. It was just, they had decided and this was it. And it seemed that they were very resentful of the fact that we were that we had critiques of their, their paving plan. And we had many critiques of their paving plan. It was about the trees, but there were so many other issues that were wrong in this plan as well. In any case, Greg Snyder from Brooklyn Zen Center and from Ancestral Heart Monastery, he and I were talking on Skype one day, and I was telling him about this, and he said, "Well, why don't I come over? I'll just drive across, and we can ordain the trees together." And it just struck me as being, yes, of course, that's what we should do, because these trees are we need to honor them. We need to honor them, the work that they've done for us. We need to honor the shade that they've provided. We need to honor their photosynthetic properties. We need to honor the beauty that they've, enjoyed, that they've given us for, the last 30 years. All of these things, just seemed really important. But also, I think what was, sort of spiritually interesting was that, first of all, these are Japanese cherry trees, right? And so in Japan, the cherry tree is really, revered as, a living being that can teach us about the Dharma, right? And in particular about transience, right? About impermanence, right? Because the cherry blossoms are so fleeting, right? They're beautiful, beautiful blossoms that come out, but then within, sometimes a few days or a week, they've scattered, right? And so there's, there are, well, I think all living, beings, all the things of the world are our teachers, right? I mean, how else can we get through, how else can we live our lives without, all of the sentient and non-sentient beings that support our lives, right? But in particular, that there's a symbolic tradition associated with the cherry blossom. And it seemed like exactly the right way to honor these trees and to try to protect them. And so we did this. We held an ordination ceremony and ordained 10 trees on the block. There were 3 venerable older trees, the 30-year-old trees. But then there were 3 trees on the corner, sort of down the block that were a little bit younger, but apparently they wanted to be ordained too. So we had the 3 elder, the 7 elder trees and then the 3 younger trees. And we ordained all of them in a very beautiful ceremony. I don't know, 60, 70 people came and, people were, really moved by it. And then we wrote a letter explaining what we had done and to the mayor, and it was signed by 120 of the leading Buddhist teachers and priests in not just in North America but internationally, and hoping that would basically asking the mayor to spare their lives, right? But last Thursday, a week ago yesterday, the Department of Public Works came in what was really a militarized operation, sending in police with flak jackets, fully armed, state police, just towed the cars without warning, and then they brought in this battalion of tree fellers, and within a couple of hours had just cut down all of the trees. People were arrested. It was, and we had a restraining order. We had a temporary restraining order to prevent the city, and they just ignored it. So it was a something. Something in this really, something in the struggle was, really touched nerves. And, and I don't know, I can't really explain it, but I think that, cutting down shade trees, in the middle of, a climate crisis while, the West Coast is burning, is really problematic. And and paving with asphalt, with petrochemicals. It's there are so many problematic, things about this whole situation, and not the least of which is the hegemonic, sort of autocratic approach of the city. So Northampton, ironically, is called Tree City. Right? It's just, now we call it Stump City.
Yeah. I mean, for those of us unfamiliar with New England, I would say Northampton, Massachusetts has the reputation and possibly is one of the most politically progressive towns.
Well, it's not.
I know. And that's the reputation, though.
And they get a lot of mileage. They get a lot of mileage off that. But, when you start to, pull back the veil, you realize that there's something else going on here that is very, very disturbing.
It is disturbing. It's so much kind of mirroring a lot of just these bureaucracies, and just sort of disregard for the planet, disregard for human lives, but it just, it seems like such a political winner to say, okay, we'll landmark the trees or something like that.
Exactly. Or we'll wait, there's, in environmental law, the precautionary principle, right? When rather than doing irrevocable damage, right, you wait, you take precautions, right? But this was, was completely ignoring and violating, and also violating the city's own commitment to, they've got this, sustainable Northampton plan, and they've got the climate regeneration and resilience plan. And literally 12 days before the notices were put up on our doors, the city council had declared that this was a climate emergency, right? There was a resolution declaring a climate emergency. And yet, so there's just a lot of greenwashing going on around here, a lot of, pretty language. And, but when it actually comes down to, the way decisions are made, it's top down,
Yeah. Would you, I'm wondering, because it's so much part of the book, it's so much part of this conversation. Is there any practice as a Zen teacher that you would recommend for people to actually start perceiving the object world or the environment world as alive or having voice? I mean, is there anything you would do? One time I asked you the question about the relationship between your meditation and your writing practice, because a lot of people who are creative people who meditate have that question. And you gave a very straightforward Zen answer, which I loved. You just said, I do both every day.
Right.
But I mean, is there any practice just in terms of the way it seems like you were perceiving the world to write this book? Is there any way, would you just do Zazen or Shikantaza, or was there any contemplation or way you would approach your daily life? I thought that might be a good way to end.
That's a really nice question. One of the things in Soto Zen that I've always felt was very beautiful is the cleaning practices, that after Zazen, after, periods of Zazen, built into the schedule, there are periods of soji, of cleaning. And the idea is that even if something doesn't necessarily look dirty, you still clean it, right? And you clean it with the same mind as, you bring your meditation mind to it, right? It's just a continuation off the cushion of, whatever it was, of the Zazen that you were doing on the cushion, right? So it's a way of bringing your Zazen back out into the world, right? And I have to say, I'm not very good at this. I'm not, if you looked around my house, it's not the cleanest place in the world. I aspire to that, right? And I do find that, that sort of setting aside those periods for a certain kind of interaction with the things in your life, right? Not in a way of like, I've got to clean this up because company's coming, but, really sort of holding things and, looking at them and making, and trying to clean them with a certain, I was going to say mindfulness, but that word almost doesn't work for me in this case. It's more creativity, right? It's seeing the object for what it is, right? And cleaning it with a certain care and respect, right? Or treating it with a certain care and respect. That strikes me as being more of a creative practice, or it once again, a kind of an expression of, of Buddha mind, right? In the same way that Zazen is an expression of Buddha mind. And I think that, art forms, art practices are also an expression of Buddha mind. But you can bring that same, Buddha mind to, to anything else that you do. And people certainly, when you're cooking, right, that's an obvious one, right? But why not do that when you're washing the dishes too? I think there's a kind of way of bringing, your whole self to meet the object, right? To meet this thing that is, part of you and part of your life, right? So I guess I'd suggest something like that, soji,
Wonderful. Thank you. I wanted to end just really encouraging people to pick up the new novel that was 9 years in the making, from Ruth Ozeki, The Book of Form and Emptiness. And they'll just end because there's a great blurb by one of my favorite fiction writers, David Mitchell, who wrote Cloud Atlas, among other books, but that one I especially love. So he said, this compassionate novel of life, love, and loss glows in the dark. If you've lost your way with fiction over the last year or two, let the Book of Form and Emptiness light your way home. So Ruth Ozeki, thank you so much for being on the Road Home podcast.
Thank you so much, Ethan. And I really look forward to reading your next work and certainly your next novel.
Okay. All right. Well, for the Road Home podcast, this is Ethan Nichtern, and see you all next time.